We are seeing a growing debate about so-called warrior cops, a term that I've heard, and the militarization of police. I think it's very important to remind our fellow citizens that we need a range of weapons and equipment to respond and protect our fellow citizens and protect ourselves. Threat! Threat!
We are at war, and you're the frontline troops in this war.
We are preparing for any type of situation. Of course, anything dealing with ISIS is a concern. We do a lot of training in the event that we had a situation like what they had in Missouri.
Disperse immediately. We have the right to assemble peace. You are violating the state laws of curfew. To assemble peace. We have the right. That is our right. You are violating the state laws of curfew.
There's actually written descriptions for how the equipment should be used, and it says it's specifically not supposed to be used for riot suppression.
I know you for a long time, bro. A long time.
Y'all still killing us.
25 years I've been here. 25 years here, I never killed a man.
Get your man.
Folks, there ain't nobody in Mexico right now complaining about militarization of police. You understand? In the very near future, you will be vindicated.
It's clear.
There's got to be some drugs here.
We need to put the brakes on the fear, and we need to act rationally. Terrorism works because it makes people irrational, and it makes them destroy themselves.
15, crash 40, 15, crash 40.
Craig, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, congratulations. I love your movie.
Thank you.
And I don't just love your movie because of what it's about and the statement that I might make. I love your movie because I think formally it was daring the way that you approached it, in the sense that there isn't a main character. There isn't a sort of driving story. The story is the different ways the policing has changed in America. And you go from place to place, sort of different elements to just show the facts about it. You clearly didn't want to seem partisan in any way. Can you talk about your decisions behind this?
Sure. It was largely due to the fact that we started a year before Ferguson, and when we started looking at police issues, the jump-off point for me was the Boston Marathon bombing, and I witnessed it was the first time that we saw the heavy armament with domestic police forces. I also noticed that the mentality had shifted, and it was more of an occupying force mentality versus a protect and serve. And what I was comparing this to was my own personal history, because my father was a police officer for 29 years outside of Detroit, and a SWAT officer for 13 of those years. And so I kind of grew up with the war on drugs era of policing, and dinner conversations, and just kind of in the background of my mind. So when I observed the Boston Marathon bombing, I just thought this was a complete departure from sort of like my father's era of SWAT. And so when we're pitching this idea around that we're going to do a story like this, this is a year before the events in Ferguson, so people didn't have too much of a context for this type of conversation. They didn't know what I was talking about. So
militarization of police wasn't a headline.
It wasn't even a headline yet. So we thought that instead of talking heads and experts would only put forth one point of view, and it might not be accurate at all. I said, what if we got the cameras into these environments where we could actually observe what domestic police were actually doing, and to not glorify the police officers and not condemn the people that were suspects, but get into the space and neutrally observe these scenes are unfolding. And I think that's what people are responding to. They said, thank you so much for not bashing the cops, but clearly showing areas where we need to improve. And so I'm happy we were able to strike that balance.
Can we talk, before we even get into sort of the politics of it, can we talk about some of your documentary influences, because I loved how sort of observant and verite and neutral it was. Were you coming from a place of like a Frederick Weissman sort of viewpoint?
Well, I mean, if you started listing films that I should have seen, or most people have seen, you'd be surprised how lacking my film history actually is.
That's fascinating, because that adds such a truthfulness to you as a filmmaker and how sort of sensitive to the material you were. That it's not about these influences that I've sort of taken from it in terms of verite filmmaking, but your tactics being solely based around the story that you wanted to tell.
Sure. I mean, I obviously didn't arrive at this place by myself. I've worked for many years with some fantastic filmmakers. Two notable filmmakers is Heidi Ewing and Rachel Grady, who did Boys in Baraka and Jesus Camp and 12th in Delaware. And we did.
You were just here for the Norman Mailer documentary.
I worked on that film as well with them. We did Ditropia together. And I spent a lot of time with them, and I would hear how they would critique other cinematographers' work. So when it was my turn to film with them, I knew what they liked, and they happened to have great taste, so it worked out for me. Also, Anat Seedy is a fantastic editor who's edited all of their work, and she helped me early on in my career to be like, you can't point the camera everywhere. You can only point it in one direction. So help us through the scene. Help us see what you're seeing. And I think that's why it's important for people in that position to educate themselves on the material and to make sure that that perspective is coming from somewhere that will, contribute to the conversation, if that's your goal, and it was for us. So,
How did you gain access to the places that you gained access to, and how difficult was it?
Well, I think that, almost every scene that we filmed almost didn't happen because, we would gain access with departments that we had a great deal of respect for, and then there'd be another police-involved shooting, and the media would kick up about it, and they would pull their access because they thought it was, not a good choice for them to participate any longer. But, we kept promising all that we had to promise, which was an authentic portrayal of whatever we did together. I said, I'm not going to manipulate the footage and re-edit it. I really want to show you or reflect back whatever we do. And I think people are quite surprised with what they chose to show us. But, when you're doing something 2-3 times a day, like a SWAT raid, to give you some context, my father was on SWAT for 13 years. He did 29 search warrants during that entire time.
29 raids, essentially.
29 raids, or SWAT callouts, but most of those were either barricaded gunman situation or raids. You contrast that to a department of a similar size that we went out with while making this film. They're doing 200 a year, 3 to 4 times a day. So there's been a significant mission creep with.
Now, why do you think that is?
Well, I think that there's a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the financial mechanism by where the police actually get to keep this money that they go and seize from citizens. There's, a law in the books called civil asset forfeiture, where, if they can basically take your property, and the burden of proof is on you to determine that it was not used in a crime. And so that opens up for a tremendous amount of abuse, because how do you prove that some money wasn't used in a drug crime? You can't. And so, when you create a financial incentive to go out and to use this equipment, well, obviously that's what's going to happen. The idea of asset forfeiture is actually a sound one if you think about it. The idea originally was that you take money away from someone who's damaging your community, you put it into a general fund for the city, and then you use those funds to improve your community. That makes a lot of sense. However, there's been loopholes put in place, not the least of which have been the equitable sharing program from the federal government. And so the Fed stepped in and said, hey, listen, if you include one federal task force agent on your SWAT team, guess what? You get to keep 80% of that money directly to your department, not going into a general fund for the city, and we get to keep 80%. So it's almost like they've created a kickback system. This is the first year, or not 2014 was the first year that more money was seized in asset forfeiture than American citizens was taken from them from actual criminal activity.
So more money in 2014 was actually seized by police officers than money was stolen from American citizens by criminals.
You got it.
That's crazy.
$5.1 billion was seized in 2014 through asset forfeiture. 3.5 was taken from American citizens from criminal activity.
Now, the way that we talk about it, though, and I think this is really important to say, because the way that we talk about it, it's as if cops are knowingly giving themselves kickbacks, being bad apples, being dirty cops, the way that it sounds. And we have a moment in your film where a police officer, after a SWAT raid, turns up literally like a half a gram of pot from some guy's backpack, pulls out $700 from the guy that he's arresting for that half a gram of pot after he's destroyed his house, essentially. Pulls out $700 from this guy's pocket, and the guy says, I'm using this to go buy a lawnmower. I'm on my way to work. I work as a landscaper, and I got to go buy my boss a lawnmower. Could you please give my boss the money so he can buy the lawnmower? And the cop says, no, I'm seizing this money, and I'm putting it into evidence. Now, that cop, is that cop a bad apple, or is that cop just doing what he is told is the right thing to do?
It's a great point. I'm glad that you brought that up, because the way I see it is that police officers so often caught in the middle of brokering services to the community, but being told and being given objectives that doesn't allow them to be the participant in the community that the community is asking them to be. And so I often see that cops are, caught in the middle. Now, that is to say that the bad apples that we do identify with, I think we absolutely need to hold those people accountable. And not only, it's just not just bad apples. Throughout the country, I've seen some bad orchards, if you will, some departments that actually need some work in general. But
the Department of Ferguson was essentially investigated by the Justice Department and was deemed a bad apple, I believe, because of their because of their asset forfeiture tactics.
Sure. Well, I mean, you think it goes much larger than that, because just to label these guys are bad apples, it doesn't really show what actually is going on in those communities. And you take a situation like Ferguson. There's 90 municipalities, 90 small cities in Ferguson. Why is that? It's because in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, a subdivision didn't want black people moving into their community, so they would incorporate that as a city, and then they would pass city ordinances that would allow code word for no black people moving into this neighborhood. Well, here we are all this time later, and 90 small cities can't afford themselves. So what did they start doing? They started taking their citizens to raise the operating revenue for the city. You have a situation where a city right next to Ferguson called Jennings, right? $1 million sales tax. They lost $1 million one year because the shopping center closed and lost $1 million of sales tax revenue. The very next year, $1 million more money from ticketing citizens. And so you've created a situation where the cops are the de facto tax collectors for a city, and we're treating citizens like ATMs. And so when you see an uprising,
we're treating poor citizens as ATMs for the most part as well.
That's a great point. And so when you see a situation in Ferguson that sparks off, and a lot of people around the country is like, well, what is the big deal? I mean, there was a lot of people out there to protest Mike Brown, but there was a lot of people out there that were protesting the decades long of rent review generation off the backs of poor people. And so when we look at situations like Charlotte and other areas of protest, it's not just that one event that people are venting from. They're venting from a long history of, this type of treatment.
Of dehumanization, which is so much of what I think your film is about. And I think revenue generating, or the people as a form of revenue generator, not as a tax base, but as an ATM, as you said, is an interesting point and taps into a lot of the points that your film makes about dehumanization when it comes to the sort of the future or current state of policing in this country. When it comes to SWATs, revenue generating, when it comes to the use of drones, the use of how we profile. You have an incredible guy that you interview who's essentially profiling people based off of their parents' criminal history and their race. Can you talk about that? Because I watched his interview. I had a screener. I watched the interview like 3 or 4 times to try to really understand what he was doing, and it's still kind of difficult to understand.
Sure.
It sounded like Minority Report, to be honest with you.
Sure. Well, I mean, you're starting to bump up against that, actually. It's when big data comes to police work. And I just think that we really have to understand that maybe the data that we're using to analyze to determine whether people should be let out of jail or not, how do we know it's the most accurate data? Because I'll tell you this, that CompStat is basically the reporting statistic. So each department reports, their level of crimes and everything. And there's a gentleman by the name of Dave Grossman in our film who's one of the top trainers. And people have commented that they haven't liked his approach. Throughout the course of the film. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. We were talking.
I was talking about the character, not Dave Grossman, the fellow who works
Dave Grossman
with
says, right, sorry. So Dave Grossman says, every police chief around the country knows that we've been cooking the books on the crime statistics forever. Well, the technology expert is using those crime statistics to determine if people are going to be likely to commit a crime, or if they should be let out of jail, or going so far that he says, right now we could predict whether a person is likely to commit a crime by the time they're 18. based off this crime statistics, who I know, or these statistics I know, haven't been incredibly accurate. Yeah, so I think we have identified a major problem in that type of policing.
Do you think that the dehumanization of the people that police officers are policing is the central problem when it comes to policing right now in our country?
I mean, there's a variety of aspects. I mean, you know, if you can't go through a traffic stop incident and reach for your wallet and not die, I mean, we have to start there, because we can't address any other issues if you're not alive to do so. You know, myself, if I get stopped and pulled over and reach for my wallet, I'm not likely to get killed. And that's why I'm able to think about all these other issues. So it depends what community you're from, which is the most crucial issue. If you're not able to survive a police interaction, clearly that we need to look at the training issues that are causing police officers to go and approach vehicles as if any moment now we're about to get assassinated and someone's going to jump out and kill someone. We need to, you know, retrain our officers in the way that they're approaching these types of citizen encounters. I mean, that would be, you know, first place for someone in that community, but there's all these other issues that once we solve that issue, there's some systemic issues in the structure and the way that we're financing our cities and department that need to look at once we get beyond these other issues.
One of the things that one of the elements of your documentary that's covered is the equipment that, and this obviously, militarization is exactly what it means. The equipment that officers are getting in small communities sometimes is like, I think it was a community in New Hampshire that you were filming, right? A small community is essentially getting a bear tactic vehicle that was being used in Afghanistan that's sort of being given to them by the government. So you have this small community in New Hampshire that essentially has a vehicle that is used for raids in Afghanistan, used for warfare in Afghanistan.
Well, you know, I think that, you know, the argument is well, terrorism can happen anywhere, and I agree, and I'm not opposed to having the equipment for officers in those scenarios. I mean, look no further than the Pulse nightclub shooting, where they used a Bearcat to puncture a hole in the wall to rescue all the hostages. That's a fantastic use of SWAT. But when you're using the exact same tools to raid houses for low-level drug offenses, well, that's when it becomes an issue. And, you know, the same department in St. Louis County that we were riding along with was raiding houses for code enforcement. You know, they broke in the house because they thought that, you know, someone had an unpaid utility bill and they wanted to check the gas hookup. Student loans. People have been raided for student loans.
The SWAT team used military arsenal to raid someone's house because they had faulted on a student loan or had unpaid debt?
Well, in this particular case, there was some question of whether or not I think that there was a illegal hookup with like a gas line. But when they entered the home, you know, the dog came after the SWAT team. The SWAT team had to kill the dog. Had to, I don't know, but they did kill the dog. And I just thought it, you know, here I'm armchair quarterbacking, of course, and I have, you know, hindsight, but if you're inspecting a gas leak and you shoot a weapon that creates a spark, I mean, how do they know that the place isn't going to explode? So I just think that there's a surge in the number of areas that SWAT teams are allowed to be deployed. In that particular county, any search warrant that's a felony search warrant is conducted by the SWAT team. I mean, we ran in a house at 2:30 in the morning to recover a computer.
You went on a raid personally to recover a computer?
Yes. I mean, it was someone that was supposed to have child pornography. Heinous crime. However, I'm not sure that we needed to do that 2:30 in the morning, and I'm not so sure that, I mean, the guy wasn't there, so it was his parents were in the house. Most houses in America have guns in them. God forbid they thought that they were being broken into and grabbed a weapon, because there's been times where people have done that. The St. Louis County SWAT team that we went out with, they raided the wrong house 6 months later. I mean, just imagine you're laying in bed and someone breaks in your house. You think it's someone attacking you or coming to, you know.
No, what about the person who hears those stories and says, well, that's that county? You went out with the St. Louis County, or there's South Carolina, was it St. Louis County? Is that who you went out with?
We did go out with them. Yeah, we went basically a half dozen raids during the course of the production. And we never found anything. I mean, we laugh, but it's not funny. I mean, we didn't find anything. And how many times? I just think that we're creating such ill will in these communities. You know, it's like when I say they're raided 200 times a year in a county, it's not all over a county. It's in one little small jurisdiction. So you're getting people that are just getting raided constantly. And just think about the ill will that creates over the course of years. And what is the next generation that's going to go up with having SWAT teams enter their homes like an occupying force time and time again?
Taking half a gram of pot or $700. They seem like occupying force that's like a shakedown artist.
Yeah, it's very difficult for people to get ahead in life when this is the type of treatment that they're having to endure on a regular basis.
What would you find that you were sort of the most shocked by in all of your research and what you were filming?
I think there is definitely a lot there. I think that the way that we're training officers, I was very astounded to hear. I mean, because as we started to see, we were really hoping that we could show the full breadth of the SWAT experience. We kept going out with SWAT teams who we thought were the good guys, and then we would go out and see some of the raids and just be like, how are we even going out like that? But, I think that when we're looking at about people reaching for their wallets and getting killed, I think there's a significant training issue there, and I think we need to start thinking about how we're communicating the role of police officers in society. We feature a gentleman by the name of Dave Grossman who, speaks about the warrior mentality, and something that he mentions that I didn't include in the film. He's like, I talk to guys all the time, and they're overseas, and they got some of the guys that come home and are domestic police forces, and they say all the time that they start to enjoy the killing, and that's not a bad place to be. Enjoy the killing. I can understand from like if you're in a war zone and you have to survive and you have to come up with some sort of mental, trick to get through that experience. But that is so far divorced from the way communities are asking from the police departments. I think they need to be guardians and not warriors. From time to time, police are asked to be warriors, and I totally understand that. But I think that the fundamental principle is that you have to value and respect life. You have to have all the tools of war, but if you can prevent a death, well, that's the goal, not that you go out and kill someone and enjoy it. I'm not saying that all officers are of this mentality, but I heard the #1 trainer, so he claims, in the country, he's required reading at the FBI Academy.
This guy, Dave Grossman.
He's required reading in many police academies throughout the country, and he's telling a group of officers when I'm standing there filming that, you go and enjoy the killing. He says, you can get held in dereliction of duty if you do not use deadly force. And that's something we saw recently in West Virginia. There was a suicidal man. I don't know if you came across this. This was 2 weeks ago. And he had a gun at his side, unarmed, or it was unloaded. No one knew that at the time. But there was a police officer who was an ex-military officer. And he had been trained by the military how to de-escalate situations. And so this guy is suicidal. He's like, shoot me, man, shoot me. And he's like, no, I don't want to shoot you. I'm not going to shoot you. We don't have to die today. We don't have to do this. And he's talking this guy off his suicidal tendencies. And 2 other officers come from the other side and shoot the guy in the head and kill the guy. This is going to shock you. Maybe not. The officer who didn't want to shoot the guy got fired. He got fired. Why did he get fired? He got fired for dereliction of duty by putting his fellow officers in danger. And I just think, what kind of a message are we sending to police departments when someone is going above and beyond, I would say, being a hero, putting his own, it's an incredibly brave act to stand down someone, you don't know if he has a gun or not, and you decide not to kill him. I just think that, there needs to be some sort of provisions that if this guy wants to be a brave person and put himself in harm's way, I just think that there needs to be a mechanism that we allow that person to do that, because he obviously valued life and he preserved life, and his reward from that was getting fired.
When do you think this started? It's always so easy to sort of look back and say it was different before this. It was different when there was this. But there's always been problems with policing in communities, and there's always a problem with authority and with people who are not authority. When did it become different?
Well, I think that, we have had a decade and a half of, preemptive war, which has not done very good things for our national deficit, and communities are getting squeezed, and people are financially being harvested, and it's very difficult for communities to support themselves. And so there's this squeeze that's happening, and I think that this is the byproduct of when everyone's getting squeezed, and the tools of war always come back home, so we've always had, people think that the hardware and the tanks initially, but now it's all the surveillance technology that's coming back, and it's even more invasive to people's privacy. So, when did it happen? I think just for a very long time, we've decided to have a war on things, in this case, the war on drugs, and that was a mechanism why we could harvest wealth out of the communities. You had private prisons being set up at the exact same time when the mandatory minimum drug sentencing laws passed. Those private prisons' stock price went up 200% because they knew they could fill more bodies in the prisons, and now we're paying for all of that. You know, now we're in a situation where we have 2.5 million people locked up. You know, a lot of them are for low-level drug offenses, but because they're mandatory minimum sentences, they're there for a long time, you know, but eventually these people have to come out. So what do? You take someone who is a pot smoker potentially, and you put them in jail for a very long time. Well, guess what? In jail, you have to be violent to survive oftentimes. So now you took someone who's just smoked weed, and now they put them in jail for 3 to 4 years, and now they have had to be violent to survive. Well, now they're back out in society. You know, so we're causing this cycle to continue by not reforming people, you know, and not giving them a chance. We need drug treatment programs and not criminalizing drugs. We need to see if that would actually work. And there are some programs around the country who are starting to do that. It's very encouraging to see that, you know, they're taking people and sending them to prison. They're sending them to drug rehabilitation facilities and counseling and stuff like that. I think that's a step in the right direction.
Absolutely. Let's open it up to the audience for some questions. Does anyone have any questions out there?
Hi, Craig. My question is, were there any issues or problems in the production with the police not cooperating?
Well, I mean, you know, we would try to get access on an ongoing basis. And like I said, if, you know, a situation turned up again, like for example, we got access to the Ohio State Patrol, and we thought they were actually a really good team that could show the breadth of SWAT work, maybe an opportunity where you'd actually see, you know, where you might need this equipment. And then Walter Scott gets murdered, and so they call us and say, don't come, you know, because they thought that maybe the immediate exposure wouldn't be good for them. So almost every scene that we were able to get in the film almost didn't happen. But, you know, it's also not unprecedented for film crews to go out with police departments. You know, the TV show Cops has been going on since 1989 doing ride-alongs. Our approach was much different because we weren't glorifying the police and we weren't condemning the people that, you know, were following. And in fact, you know, instead of pixelated faces of just unknown suspects, we went back the next day and talked to the people that were raided because I wanted to know their point of view. How did that feel? And they said, well, I felt like it was going to be like a terrorist attack. And I understand why, because, you know, these officers are like, we're preparing for ISIS, you know, so, but they're not using it for ISIS. They're using it for these other purposes. So, yeah, access was a very difficult thing throughout the course.
How do you think it's possible that any sort of change can be made when I think we're in an election right now where even just criticizing the police has become a bipartisan issue? You have one side, the Trump side, that says, no, you support police, you don't talk about racial injustice or institutional violence because we support the police. And then you have Hillary Clinton, who at the very least is saying, like, let's talk about it. There might be a problem here. But the country itself is just finding itself in this 50-50 split in one more time, rather than even being able to have any sort of criticisms of the police. It's a 50-50 split.
Sure. I think, I mean, you know, in 6 weeks from now, this election is going to blow over, and we'll have an amazing amount of work to be done at that point. I think that we're in this period of divide and conquer where we're just being pitted against one another. And so, you know, as long as we keep that up, you know, the real issues that need to be talked about are just going to be surged forward in such a way that continues to erode our freedoms. So we can either decide to continue to be divided and conquered, or we can decide after this election, how are we actually going to move forward in a productive way that can help police understand what the community is asking from them, and they will then have an opportunity to communicate to the community what they're hoping from them as well. But, you know, in this election cycle, issues are sidelined so that we can bicker at one another.
Next question.
Hi, I just want to know, what is your opinion on how the media cover police shootings and how they portray like both the shooter, both the police officer and the victims?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I can give you my perspective from how the media covered Ferguson, and I don't think it's too dissimilar to how they're covering these shootings. You know, we would be there throughout the night, and most media would have to leave at 11 p.m. because they had to go home and file their stories the next day. Well, we were able to stay out till 4 o'clock in the morning. And so you'd go home and watch the news the next day at 10 a.m. and there'd be a vast discrepancy between what actually happened that night and what we saw, you know. And I think that, you know, I was watching the Charlotte coverage the other night, and it was just cameras fixed on waiting for something to happen, waiting for some action to take place. And so while we're sitting there waiting for all this action to take place, no one's actually talking about the real systemic issues that could actually, the discussion of which be used to move things forward. So it continues to be a sensationalized moment, and it gets a lot of ratings, so they continue that sensationalism because it's working for them, because we tune into it.
I mean, sensationalized to the point where just the other day, I think 2 days ago in Charlotte, a reporter got pushed to the ground by someone, and CNN's headline immediately was "Protesters Attacking Media." And it was like, no, there was a reporter that was in someone's way, or maybe he just pushed one guy pushed a reporter, and it's protesters attacking media.
I was watching that segment, and like 2 hours later in the coverage, the guy who hit the guy came back and apologized to him all there and said, "Listen, I was just being frustrated," and he actually, you know, had this exchange where he just apologized. But prior to that, I mean, without going too, you know, hardcore on one particular news network, I will say that, you know, when I was in Ferguson, there was, you know, Don Lemon standing there, and he said, "Oh my God, the cops shut down the road, and, you know, no one can get home from work, and it's just creating such issue." And, well, no, Don, it's actually 9:30 at night. No one's coming home from work. And the reason why the police shut down the road is because the protesters were doing a demonstration where they were laying in the road. And so if they didn't shut down the road, they were going to get run over. So, but on CNN, that was, you know, oh my God, look at what the cops are doing now. And so, you know, we really have to be mindful of the way that we're communicating these things, because it's fueling the fire.
Yeah, I mean, you see, we'll go one more in on CNN. I mean, you see sometimes the way that they talk about these protests in the way where they're like, there's another protest tonight, let's just hope the protesters stay peaceful. It's always on the protesters' end to stay peaceful. It's never discussed that there may be a provocation, that there may be actual sort of feuds going on between police and the protesters. It's always, let's hope the protesters stay peaceful.
Sure. I mean, and I can say from just my peripheral experience of being in Ferguson, I mean, there's a variety of people that show up to these protests. There's children, there's women, there's a huge demographic. It's usually the young kids late at night who have a lot of energy when things like start to kick up. And it's not so much always in the spirit of violence. It's more like it's young like angst, you know, doing like no different than egging a house, just on a different, you know, on a obviously more level. And obviously any violence we should condemn immediately, but I don't think that it's just indicative of, you know, all the people that are out there, and so many people have legitimate reasons for why they're actually out there, and what we're doing is seeing the protests, they're just, you know, burning things down or breaking things. That is one small subset of people, and it just totally detracts away from all the people that are there who are really trying to, you know, communicate to the country that there's a deep issue that we need to look at.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi,
if it's about CNN, that's great. Sorry, no, go ahead.
What are your thoughts on mental health in the police force?
Great question. You mean the individual officers, or yeah? Well, that's a great question. So I was filming with an organization who is attempting to reel SWAT in, meaning they're trying to come up with standards in order to reel SWAT in. And I was really disturbed to hear during the course of one of these lectures, the guy says, how many people do psychological testing? And like one guy raised their hand. And he's like, yeah, we stopped doing it. And I said, well, why do we stop doing it? And he said, well, and some guy from the back, he's like, well, because you found out they weren't supposed to be a police officer. And the guy's like, yep. He's like, so you train this guy up, you give him all these tactics, and then you send him to the shrink, you know, to get evaluated, and he has a bad day, and so they don't let him be on your SWAT team, and then they have to fire him from the department because, you know, he had a bad day and didn't answer the shrink's questions right. So they stopped doing the psychological testing. I'm not sure that's the exact approach. I mean, I understand that the relationship between the mental health professionals and police departments are often strained because a lot of the mental health professionals give the cops a hard time. And so there is that dynamic. But I don't think that we should just stop psychologically testing the police officers. I'm hoping, you know, some of these surveillance tools that they're, you know, coming up with to determine if there's a terror somewhere and doing psychological profiles on people, you know, maybe we can create a awareness of officers who might actually go, you know, too far in their work. So it's an issue.
And what about policing the mentally ill, which has been a pretty big issue the past few years in the sense that most clinics have been shut down, most sort of access to any sort of health care for the mentally ill has been shut down, and police officers in prisons have essentially been the ones left to deal with those that are mentally ill in our community.
That's so true, and I think that's something that we really need to look at, because the police officers are not responsible for the ills of society. They're not responsible for the structural failings of society, and so we put them in this position where 10 times out of 10, when I'm doing 9.9 times out of 10 when I'm doing ride-alongs with police departments during the course of making this film, they're responding to mental health crisis or to domestic violence situation, which is asking them to de-escalate situations. And I will say that I've noticed many officers grossly unprepared to de-escalate a situation. But if it turned violent, they were absolutely trained and able to put down that violence with more violence in a very efficient way. And so, I think even the raid that we did in South Carolina, they were expecting a full-on shootout. This is a gun raid, and they thought that there was going to be guns anywhere. They show up, the guy's in a wheelchair. They didn't know how to, get this guy out of the rain and with the wheelchair.
Was that the raid that had the guy in the wheelchair and the other guy smoking a cigarette and
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that was.
Yeah, so I mean, if that guy pulled out an Uzi and started, obviously they would be able to take care of that guy, but they were just dumbfounded with how to interface with someone like that. And that's maybe not the best example, but I will say that as we're going out on ride-alongs, that is the major component, that people are responding, cops are responding to situations where they need to de-escalate the situation, and I think that training needs to be put in the front of police training more
that
than
training
anything,
needs
that's
to
what
be
they're
escalated.
requiring. That needs to be escalated, yes.
Craig, when can people see Do Not Resist, your fantastic documentary?
So I really hope people come out and see it in theaters. We're opening September 30th at the Film Forum, and we're going to do 20 markets after that, so everyone will get a chance to see it in the theaters. And I really think that that's the venue for this particular film, because the conversations that we've been able to have afterwards have been very productive.
Before we wrap up, obvious question that I should have asked before. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this. Have you shown this documentary to officers? What has been the general response from police officers?
We had an amazing screening at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. There was active NYPD officers there, and they came up and they said they thought that every police department should show this. Every police academy should show this. They thanked me for making this film because they thought that we didn't condemn the officers, but we pointed people to areas within police work that absolutely need reform. And so I'm happy that we struck that balance. We made it available to everyone who participated in the film. Some watched it, some not. And so I just
has Grossman still not?
I have not got any response back from him. I'm hoping that before too long, he'll reach out, because I would love to start a dialogue with him and to share the film. So we'll see.
Craig, congratulations on incredible work. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.